try to discipline yourself and read every day like we're talking about in these reading plans. In the flesh, when you get to these short books, it's kind of a treat. You say, oh, I just got 3 chapters and I'll be done with that book. Probably not the way we should approach it, but that's how you do it sometimes. And I think I'm in Zechariah now. We should be near the end. I'm in Zechariah, just starting Revelation in the New Testament, because I just got a few more days till the year's over. But you know, even if my daily reading says like Nahum chapter number 1, I typically would read all 3 because it's such a short book, and I like to get the context. Maybe you might do that too. But in these little short books, when you get there for your daily reading, it's just as easy to sit down and read 3 or 4 chapters and get the entire prophecy together instead of breaking it up. That's usually how I do it. And that's how I approached Nahum when I read it a couple, 2 or 3 weeks ago. All right, so again, just as a refresher, it might seem, you know, a not very consequential book. Might not seem like it's very applicable. But everything in the scriptures is of consequence, and it is applicable. And if it wasn't here, I mean, if it was here, if it's here, then it means that we need to read it and study it. If the Lord didn't want us to read it, He wouldn't have put it in here. Wouldn't have allowed us this as a part of the canon of Scripture. It's probably, you know, even though it's a burden of Nineveh and directed towards them, it's applicable to us, and it's not improper to take it and apply it to any wicked city or wicked place. But if nothing else, just behold the grandeur of God. Behold the holiness of God, the depravity of men, and that conflict that exists between a holy God and a depraved and wicked people is always going to result in God's judgment and justice being victorious. And there isn't any wicked people that's going to escape judgment. You know, I'm reading in the book of Job also for my daily reading. And, you know, that's what his 4 friends keep trying to tell Job, is that, you know, the Lord rewards the righteous and He judges the wicked. Well, Job's making it plain to him, well, how come so many wicked folks live long lives and are rich and die, and their descendants take their inheritance and they live on? If that's true. And even the Jews were just obsessed with that idea, that in the flesh, that the Lord would reward the righteous and punish the wicked. Well, we know that that's not always the case as it plays out in this life, but don't imagine that though the wicked might prosper in this life for a while, that they'll prosper in eternity, because they won't. And when the wicked people oppose themselves, and that's one of the things you'll notice in chapter number 3 when the Lord says He's against them. When wicked people are against God, or God's against the wicked, and there's that opposition that exists between them, there's not ever going to be a compromise. There's not ever going to be a partial victory for the wicked. They might have some things they enjoy in this life, but that's just a drop in the bucket compared to the eternity itself, where God's judgment and justice will be properly administered. Sometimes it's administered in this life, but often, you know, sometimes the sins go beforehand, and sometimes not. And so in this case, the Lord is going to judge Nineveh, and they're going to be judged in this life as a city and as a people. Well, He did the same thing to many other cities as well. So He says, and this is addressed to the city of Nineveh, He says in verse number 1 of chapter 3, woe to the bloody city, it is all full of lies and robbery, the prey departeth not. So it's a bloody city, meaning they're cruel. They're also, you know, if you know, when you do a little study on the Old Testament history, a lot of times you'll encounter like drawings and things of the Old Testament kings and armies and stuff, and the Assyrians just looked cruel, the way they drew them up and the way you'd see them in the drawings, and they were a fearsome people, and it's a bloody city, and they conquered you know, a lot of the Middle East, and they're full of lies and robbery. The prey departeth not. They're all the time hunting somebody or something or some place or some people, and there's just depravity and sin and deceit, you know, throughout the bloody city. And again, this is the same city that previously had repented at the preaching of Jonah, but they've gone back into their evil ways. The noise of a whip and the noise of the rattling of the wheels, of the prancing horses and of the jumping chariots. Now, I think this is probably speaking of their destruction, and probably not a reference to the Ninevites, but to those that would conquer the Ninevites, which would be the Babylonians, and how that they're going to come into the city. Remember, we noticed that in the last chapter, how that the chariots would run through the city with the flaming torches in verse number 3. They'll rage in the streets in verse number 4 of chapter number 2. Then it says in verse 3 of chapter 3, the horseman lifted up both the bright sword and the glittering spear, and there's a multitude of slain and a great number of carcasses, and there is none end of their corpses. They stumble upon their corpses. And of course, it could describe the cities that Assyria and Nineveh have conquered, but it is going to be the fate of Nineveh itself, none end of their corpses. And it's a frightening thing to imagine. Such a great city just full of corpses, people being slain in the streets, and that's the burden. That's what the prophecy says, and this is what will happen. And history proves that it did happen, because of the multitude of the whoredoms of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcrafts, that selleth nations through her whoredoms and families through her witchcrafts. I'm not sure why the witchcraft is mentioned here, and it's directed at the city of Nineveh. It could be something that they practiced a lot, or it might just be a reference to their idolatry. It could be a reference to the female goddesses that they might have worshipped. But you can see what they did as a people. They sold nations through their whoredoms, and so they made affinity with nations and destroyed nations, and so it's like they could buy and sell peoples and entire cities and nations, and using their idolatrous and their evil ways. Then it says in verse number 5, behold, I am against thee. Now remember, like I said in Romans chapter number 8, it says, if God be for us, who can be against us? That's what we would rather have said. It's a frightening thing, and it's the exact opposite when it says here, behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts. And if the Lord is against us, then who can be for us? There isn't any hope for us if the Lord is against us. You can assemble all of your armies, you can assemble all of your peoples, and everybody in your nation and in your city can be gathered together to oppose whatever fate the Lord has decreed. But if the Lord is against us, there isn't any hope for us. And it doesn't matter who's for us, because whoever is for us is of no consequence when compared to the one who's against us, if it is the Lord of hosts. And I'm speaking as a people, or as a city in this case. And I will discover thy skirts upon thy face, and I will show the nations thy nakedness, and the kingdoms thy shame. So they're going to be embarrassed, they're going to be shamed because of what they've done. The folks are going to know just how deceitful they were, and how they played one nation against another, and how they sought the ruin of so many around them. It was a habit in those days and times. You can tell this even in reading the book of Genesis. Even just thinking about Abraham in his time, when a rival nation would conquer, a neighboring nation, they didn't just put them to tribute and leave them there. They packed them up and carried them away somewhere else, so that they wouldn't ever arise again and rebel against the ruling kingdom. That's what the Assyrians did to the Israelites. They carried them into Assyria. And then they brought other peoples into that land to dwell where the Israelites used to dwell. And that's why, in the New Testament, that's why the Jews wouldn't go through Samaria, because they were the descendants of the people that the Assyrians and the Babylonians brought into the land to dwell there when they removed the Israelites and the Jews to some distant land. And it was always done so that the nation, it wouldn't be full of people that grew up there, and then that they would spark a rebellion at some point and try to raise up and cast off their overlords. So this is what they did. They played nation against nation. They would carry some here and another there, and a nation as powerful as Assyria was able to do this in quite a broad area. And others would find out what they did and how they deceived, and they negotiated surrenders and then carried peoples and cities captive somewhere else, and others, and so it genders animosity. So none of the nations that they had conquered, or the peoples that they had conquered, none of them they would all be happy to see Nineveh destroyed. And I will cast abominable filth upon thee, and make thee vile, and will set thee as a gazing stock. So despite how proud they were of their city, how confident they were in their strength, the Lord's going to cast filth upon them and make them vile. They're going to be a gazing stock. And then even the peoples that aren't a country anymore, it says in verse 7, it shall come to pass that all they that look upon thee shall flee from thee and say, Nineveh is laid waste. Who will be moaner? Whence shall I seek comforters for thee? They're not going to have a whole lot of sympathy amongst the peoples that they've conquered. But I think it's also saying that all the people that would have been sad and would have bemoaned her loss are going to be either destroyed or carried away. And Nineveh is going to be laid waste. And there's not going to be anybody that's going to comfort the remnant. He says in verse number 8, art thou better than populous No, that was situate among the rivers, that had the waters round about it, whose rampart was the sea, and her wall was from the sea. Now, when you read, do some research on this. I didn't do much, but I read a little bit about this. The city of No probably is in Egypt, or was in Egypt, maybe much bigger than the city of Nineveh, which we know was a large city. Had thousands of soldiers in it. And some think that No might even be another reference for the city of Alexandria in Egypt. But it was probably a place that Ham built, one of the sons of Noah, or at least some of his direct descendants built it. And it was a very populous city and very powerful, and yet the Lord would destroy it as well. And it would be destroyed and brought down. There's a little description of it made here. And then it says Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was infinite. It's apparently, strength without end. Put and Lubim were thy helpers, which were just other geographic areas. Yet was she carried away, she went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed in pieces at the top of all the streets, and they cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. I thought about that when I don't do this often when we're just going through these chapters, since we try to move right along. So if you go back to 2 Kings, well, I'm just telling you, there's his historic account of what is prophesied here in the book of Nahum. I guess that's what I want you to see. If you look in chapter 17, there's Hosea begins to reign in Samaria over Israel, which is the northern kingdom. It says in verse 3, against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria. And Hosea became his servant and gave him presents. So they kind of put the whole land under tribute. But really, if you look at it carefully, you find out he just put them under tribute just in preparation for destroying them and carrying them away captive. And he found conspiracy in Hosea, and they bound him in prison. And then the king of Assyria came up and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. Samaria was the capital city of Israel. And then in the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria. And this is what I was telling you before. Placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan and in cities of the Medes. So they would dwell where the Medes and the Persians were, which would become a part of the Babylonian Empire later on. But at this point, they were under the control of Assyria. So, they just carried them away captive. But then it says in, down in verse 24. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cutha, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria, instead of the children of Israel. They possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. So this is what I was telling you before, how they would carry the people of the land captive to another place, and those people that they conquered, they would carry over here, and they would do that all over their kingdom, so that there wouldn't be any unified resistance against them. And you got strangers living in strange lands, and when the king of Assyria does this, and then when the king of Babylon does it later on, people that live in the land of Israel are asking the kings, we don't know the God of this land, and remember, they had to send them Levites to teach them the true God, because the land wouldn't put up with the people that were living there, since they weren't the descendants of Abraham. And so if you go back and read it, I haven't read it for a while, but I think they were being attacked by lions and other things. So they had to have priests and Levites come to teach them how to worship God, so that they could even live in this land. But that's what I'm saying. The kings are going up just so that they have strangers living in places that they didn't grow up, and they can eliminate any opposition to their reign. Now this is the king that this is what they did to the Israelites. This is the same king in the same nation, the same city, Nineveh, that would then attack Judah when Hezekiah was king. And if you look over in chapter number 18, it says in verse number 13 of 2 Kings 18, verse 13, it says, "Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. But now Hezekiah was a good and a godly king, and he turned to the Lord. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria to Lachish, saying, I have offended, return from me that which thou puttest on me." So he's not going to rebel like Hoshea did in Samaria. "And the king of Assyria appointed to Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold." And then it says down in verse 17, so despite what Hezekiah did to pay tribute, the king of Assyria still intends to carry them away into captivity. So in verse 17, the king of Assyria sent Tartan and Rabsaris and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a great host against Jerusalem. And they went up and came to Jerusalem, and when they were come up, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is in the highway of the fuller's field. So they had conquered Judah to the extent that probably the only cities left were Jerusalem and Lachish that still resisted the Assyrians. And all the people had fled into the mountains or into these cities. And they intend to carry them all away captive. And here they are besieging the city of Jerusalem. And when they had called to the king, there came out to them Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, which was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder. And Rabshakeh said unto them, "Speak ye now to Hezekiah. Thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria." Now this is similar to what the Lord in Nahum prophesied. The Lord through Nahum prophesied to Nineveh, comparing their strength and their might to other cities that have been destroyed. Sennacherib does the same thing. His general Rabshakeh says, "What confidence is this wherein thou trustest? Thou sayest, but they are vain words. They are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for the war. Now on whom dost thou trust, that thou rebellest against me? Now behold, thou trustest upon the staff of this bruised reed, even upon Egypt, on which if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, unto all that trust on him." There may have been a league still between the nation of Egypt and the land of Judah, but it's a dangerous thing to trust Pharaoh, is what the Assyrians are telling. You might lean on him for strength, but the staff that you're leaning on might pierce your own hand. "But if you say unto me, we trust in the Lord our God." So now this is the king Hezekiah that had cleansed the land and told the people to trust the Lord, don't worship idols, and don't offer sacrifices to God outside, in worship outside the temple. If at all possible, he comes to the temple for worship. And this is what he's talking about. He says, "We trust in the Lord our God. Is not that he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah hath taken away, and hath said to Judah and Jerusalem, Ye shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Now therefore I pray thee, give pledges to my lord the king of Assyria, and I will deliver thee 2,000 horses, if thou be able on thy part to set riders upon them. How then wilt thou turn away the face of one captain of the least of my master's servants, and put thy trust on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen?" And then he gets a little deceitful. Remember it said back in chapter 3 of Nahum, "Woe to the bloody city, it's all full of lies and robbery." And so he gets deceitful here. He says, "Am I now come up without the Lord against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, Go up against this land and destroy it." And so he's kind of trying to trick and use subterfuge against the people. It may be that the Lord, certainly it was in the Lord's will that he would destroy Israel, but not the land of Judah. Then said Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna, and Joah unto Rabshakeh, "Speak, I pray thee, to thy servants in the Syrian language, for we understand it. And talk not with us in the Jews' language in the ears of the people that are on the wall." But Rabshakeh said unto them, Hath my master sent me to thy master and to thee to speak these words? Hath he not sent me to the men which sit on the wall, that they may eat their own dung and drink their own piss with you? Because he's going to have them in a siege. Then Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language, and spake, saying, Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus saith the king, Let not Hezekiah deceive you, for he shall not be able to deliver you out of his hand. Neither let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, The Lord will surely deliver us, and this city shall not be delivered into the hand of the king of Assyria. Hearken not to Hezekiah, for thus saith the king of Assyria, Make an agreement with me by a present, and come out to me, and then eat ye every man of his own vine, and every one of his fig tree, and drink ye every one of the waters of his cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of corn and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of oil, olive, and of honey, that ye may live and not die, and hearken not unto Hezekiah when he persuadeth you, saying, The Lord will deliver us. You know, there's a lot of that goes on in the world today. People tell us not to trust in the Lord, but Hezekiah wanted his people to trust in the Lord. Hath any of the gods of the nations delivered at all his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and of Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Ivah? Have they delivered Samaria out of mine hand? Who are they among all the gods of the countries that have delivered their country out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? But the people held their peace and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was, saying, Answer him not. So I won't read any further there, but Hezekiah hears what's been said here, and he turns to the Lord, and the Lord sends an angel out into the host and destroys 180,000 soldiers that very night, or in this time frame, and the siege is turned away. This is the city that we're talking about. This is the nation that we're talking about in the book of Nahum. The Lord would destroy them just because of, if nothing else, because they brought reproach upon his name. So remember back in Nahum chapter number 3, he's talking about the city of No, populous No. Same arguments that the king of Assyria used. So what about the gods of Sepharvaim? What about all these other lands? Nobody could defend them. I conquered them. The Lord's saying, well, you look at these other lands, and they didn't. They're not preserved, and they've been destroyed. The same will happen to Nineveh. And so it says, speaking of Noah, it says in verse number 10 of chapter 3, it says, Yet was she carried away, she went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed in pieces at the top of all the streets, and they cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. They were led away into slavery, and many were slain, even the young children. Thou also shalt be drunken, thou shalt be hid, thou also shalt seek strength because of the enemy. So they're going to be afraid, and they're going to look to others for strength to defend them. All thy strongholds shall be like fig trees with the first ripe figs. If they be shaken, they shall even fall into the mouth of the eater. Which is a really good metaphor or picture here. Just think of a tree, they're using a fig tree, but use another tree, a fruit tree as an example if you want, where the fruit is ripe and you shake it, and the fruit just falls off the tree, and the one that's doing the shaking just opens up his mouth and consumes the fruit. And that's the strength of Nineveh. I don't know, I think I've even seen that in some of the Mediterranean countries. That's how I think that's how they reap the olive trees, isn't it? Don't they have like a machine and it puts a big piece of canvas underneath of it, wrapping around the tree, and then they shake the tree until all the olives fall off. Maybe they do that with fig trees as well. Then they gather up the tart, and they've got all the fruit. Well, this is what he's saying. This is how weak, how tentative, I guess, maybe these strongholds are. That if they be shaken, they're going to fall down. Behold, thy people in the midst of thee are women. The gates of thy land shall be set wide open unto thine enemies. The fire shall devour thy bars. There's not going to be any courage left, no strength left. Then he again, maybe this is a bit sarcastic. He says, draw thee waters for the siege. Fortify thy strongholds. Go ahead and do everything you want to try to defend yourself. Go into clay and tread the mortar. Make strong the brick kiln. He says, there shall the fire devour thee. While you're trying to ramp up your defenses and strengthen yourself, the fire will devour thee. The sword shall cut thee off. It shall eat them up. Like the cankerworm, make thyself many as the cankerworm, make thyself many as the locust. So they're going to be destroyed, just like the cankerworm destroys the riches of this world. The locusts come and destroy. He says in verse 16, "Thou hast multiplied thy merchants above the stars of heaven. The cankerworm spoils and fleeth away." I was thinking that that's kind of relative to what the Lord said. That He tells us to store our treasures up in heaven, where there isn't moth or rust or thieves to break through and steal. The Ninevites and the Assyrians stored their treasure up on this earth. The cankerworm, the locust, the grasshoppers would destroy what they had gathered up, and it would be there today and gone tomorrow. So thy crown are as the locusts, and thy captains as the great grasshoppers, which they did kind of ravage the entire area. They destroyed so many countries and so many cities, which camp in the hedges in the cold day. But when the sun arises, they flee away, and their place is not known where they are. And now you'd be hard-pressed. I mean, people don't even know precisely where that city of Nahum was in Egypt. They can't even properly determine which city that is being referred to here. And the same might be true of Nineveh and some of these other places, even though, these, you may know their location. It's just that for decades or centuries, there was nobody there. And it probably had to be, the ruins had to be found and then built again. And their place is not known where they are. Thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people is scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathereth them. It's not like the people of the Lord who would be scattered, but then the Lord would gather them up again. And he still will. And you have that in some of these minor prophets. You have references to the Lord gathering together his people again, despite the fact that he's going to judge them. And there's a lot of reference to the millennial reign when the Lord will gather his people together again. But not so with the Assyrians. There is no healing of thy bruise. Thy wound is grievous. All that hear the bruit of thee shall clap their hands over thee, for upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually? So it's a bloody city. It's full of lies and robbery. It's destroyed many other lands and many other cities. This is the judgment that the Lord has pronounced upon them. Like I said, there isn't any opportunity, well, there isn't any possibility of victory for the Ninevites, for the Assyrians. They can't. When God is against them, his judgment is going to be poured out. And it says, "For upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually?" They've been so evil and wicked to others that there's not any left now that even mourn the passing of the city. Now, in some ways, you can almost see Jonah's attitude here. Remember how Jonah preached to them? He didn't care for them. He didn't have any compassion on them. He really just wanted to see them destroyed. That's how wicked the place was. But they repented and they turned to the Lord. I think it was genuine. And then at some point, they turned back to their wicked ways, and there isn't any. I remember we read that in the first chapter. He's slow to anger and great in power. He will not at all acquit the wicked. So they were returned to their wickedness, and he's not going to acquit them this time. He's going to judge them even in this life. And then very soon, it's probably the nation of Babylon will destroy this city of Assyria. But this is the fate of the wicked. There isn't any healing of the bruise. The wound is grievous. We can't cure it ourselves. If you just want to apply this in a spiritual fashion to those that are lost and undone, there isn't any healing of our bruise. We can't dress ourselves up and make ourselves acceptable in the sight of God. We can't make ourselves pure or righteous, and so that we won't have to fear the judgment of God. We're just wicked and in no better shape than these Ninevites, unless the Lord would be gracious to us. But in the case of this city, their judgment is pronounced in this prophecy. All right, so I'm going to stop right there.